I get a lot of questions about what's the best Bible translation? Should I use this translation or this translation? And it comes up reasonably often. And it's not an easy question to answer. So let's talk about that in this video. Let's get into it. Hi, I'm Darryl Belling from Master New Testament Greek, here to help you with the tools, habits, and system to master the Greek of the New Testament. If you're interested in learning Greek, or at least having a better understanding of the Greek New Testament, then hit the like button and hit the subscribe button. Make sure you don't miss out on any of these videos. So I get a lot of questions about, is the ESV more accurate or the ASV? Or should I use the New American Standard Bible? Or whatever it happens to be. I get questions about translations that are good for missionaries. All sorts of things like that. I thought I would take my time, actually record a video to help you think through the issue of Bible translations. And you've probably seen charts like this one that sort of show all of the different translations available and whether they're more accurate or less accurate and so on. Also the type of translation. We have literal translations, which are word for word translations. We have dynamic equivalent translations, which intend to be more idea for idea or thought for thought. And then sometimes we have paraphrases. I don't know if anybody actually still buys paraphrases. I never look at them anymore. But the idea of a paraphrase is it's really not interested in being based on the Greek. It tends to be more about, or the Hebrew for the Old Testament, it's really more about just writing something that people will enjoy reading that's roughly equivalent to what the text is saying. But there's a lot more translation and interpretation. Let me rephrase that. There's a lot more interpretation in a paraphrase than there is in, any of the legitimate translations. So a legitimate translation is a formal equivalent translation or a dynamic equivalent translation. Formal equivalent being the literal translation, dynamic equivalent being those that are, more of a thought for thought idea. Now, bear in mind that when people approach the idea of translating a text into any language really, but particularly here in Greek, when we're talking about Bible translations, people who are picking the literal idea or the formal equivalent translation approach, their idea, their philosophy is to try and bring the text of the original language over into English as best they can. And there's always a sacrifice here. Because if you bring it across word for word, it's not always going to be super simple. It's not always going to be, it's not always going to make sense. So you're going to have times in Greek where you have, say, the article, and then you're going to have a substantive, and then in between you're going to have a whole bunch of adjectives. So in Jude, for instance, right, there's the article, once for all delivered to the saints, faith, right? That's literally how it's worded in the Greek. Now, if you were to translate that using word for word, that's how it would come out. But most translations will say the faith once for all delivered to the saints, which is far more easier to read in English. So the way a formal equivalent is trying to work is it's trying to bring the word order as best it can into English, but at the same time without sacrificing too much readability. A dynamic equivalent translation, on the other hand, is focused more on how readable is this. And again, you're going to see that some of these are more dynamic than others. Some of them still, again, it's that same balance of, and we're going to go for absolute accuracy and try and get this as close as I can, or is it more about actually making it readable? And therein lies things like, do we allow things like contractions? Do not versus don't. Right? Which of those do we use most of the time in our common language? We use don't. We use contractions all the time. We only use do not if we're trying to make something really emphatic. And so if you were to bring that into English again, you actually end up making a more formal English translation rather than a colloquial English translation. And a lot of the Greek texts, and Hebrew for that matter as well, they're not always that formal. Sometimes they're quite colloquial. And so style issues are actually very difficult to manage even in translations as well. But the point here I'm trying to make is really that the philosophy by which the translation committee start with, that is going to make a difference as to how the translation actually works. So the question is not so much one of what's the most accurate, it's just the best, it's more like what is the best way to bring this into English? And the answer to that question depends on what the translation committee is trying to do, how they're trying to serve you and I as the readers. And that then comes back to you and I. What is it that you're trying to do? Do you want to read the text, in which case a dynamic equivalent translation may be perfectly adequate? Or are you trying to study the text, in which case a formal equivalent text would probably be a better choice? And most of the questions you get around accuracy, which is the most accurate translation, come from people who are wanting to study the text. But even when you go to that track and you look at it from that point of view, it's still not an easy decision. I'm going to show you by jumping into two texts in the book of Matthew, just to sort of show some of the issues that lie underneath the text of the New Testament, just as we translate it. So before I flick over to the computer to show you those in a bit more detail, if you're getting value out of this, hit the like button. That does help this video get found, and that helps me as a creator help you by produce more videos of this kind, because I know you like them as well. So let's flick over anyway to the computer. All right, so here we are in Logos Bible Software, and I've got my Greek text up on the left-hand side here. I'm going to add here, in Logos, we have this text comparison tool, which is just phenomenal. This is a great tool just for helping us to see different texts side by side. And what I've done here is I've taken a number of English texts that are pretty popular today, and I've added them to the list of or variations on the right. Now, you can actually change the layout of this if you'd prefer. You can click the little three dots up here and you can choose automatic layout, which is vertical normally for me, but I want to go with horizontal. I want columns. And I've also got show differences. You can actually turn those off if you want to. And so turn the differences on. You can even have it so that it shows the base text as well. Now, I want you to see a couple of things here. First of all, look at the order here in the Greek. Me nomisate. This is, do not suppose, do not think that I've come to destroy or abolish the law or the prophets. Okay, so this is what we have here in our Greek text. So look at the King James. First of all, think not. Now, this is not how you and I would typically talk today. And what we're seeing here is that there's a distinction between the King James of 1900, which is itself based on Tyndale's translation from 1536. Obviously, 1536 came through 1611, and then this is obviously an updated 1900 King James. But nonetheless, the text is largely the same, little edits here and there. But the King James really is our foundation text here. And the King James was written during a time when the English language was very different to what it is today. Back in the days of the King James, English was coming out of the phase where it was an inflected language. Now, English was not fully inflected at this point by any stretch of the imagination, but you still had a lot more flexibility over word order than what we have today, and it was very understandable for people back in the 1600s and earlier as well. Today, we have much more fixed word order in English. We work on subject, verb, object, and in Greek you could change that and you would understand it pretty easily. Now, we can still understand it, but it's just a little bit more what we would call stilted or wooden, and much more difficult to understand. And so what we have in the King James and in the American Standard Version is really a reflection of that much older style of English that nobody today really uses. And as you can see, as we go through into 1984, do not think, right? So now you're starting to put your negation prior to your verb, which is pretty much what the Greek actually does as well. The negation always comes before the verb in Greek anyway. And in this case, we have do not think or do not suppose that I've come to destroy the law. So think not, think not, think not, and then we have do not think. Okay, do not think that I have come. Let me just turn off the differences here. We'll see the differences as we go through anyway. So we'll turn off that base text. You can see the circle here is where words have been changed or dropped out. So anyway, think not that I have come to abolish the law. Do not think that I have come to abolish the law. Do not think that I came in the New American Standard. And do not think that I have come. So these are, you can see here that as we move into the later texts, we're starting to speak much more like you and I would speak today. And this is the thing, right? If you're looking for a translation that is faithful, it may not translate things exactly word for word all the time because it's trying to make it understandable. And the way things are written in Greek is often very different to the way things are written in English. Word order is very different, and so we can't always assume that the way it is in Greek is just going to flow naturally over. Let me show you one other thing that's fascinating here, I think, in terms of translation, and that is, do not think that I am come. Look at this verb, I am come. Do not think that I came, we have here in the American Standard Version. And then we have not I am come, that I have come in the Revised Standard Version. And then that I have come in the NIV also follows the RSV here. Not that the NIV is based on the RSV, it's a fresh translation. And then we have the New American Standard. Do not think that I came. Now that's interesting. And then we have come. Do not assume, different translation here of nomisate. with the Holman, which I actually quite like, that I came again and then have come. So what's going on here? Well, with these translations here, they are looking at Althon. This is an aorist active indicative, third person singular, first person singular rather, I have come. So the key thing here is, what do the translators understand the aorist tense form is being used to do? So what we have with the New American Standard is actually pretty consistently a tense-oriented understanding of how the Greek verbs actually work. This is where your verbal aspect argument actually comes out in a translation. The New American Standard translators have an understanding of the Greek that it's very much a temporal language. So the aorist tense form actually reflects then the fact that this is a past tense verb. In fact, they would regard the aorist tense form as a simple past tense, right? So they translate it here that I came, right? That's a simple English past tense. So they translate it consistently with that. Now, I would differ with that. I don't think that the Greek of the New Testament is primarily temporal at all. I would say, in fact, that it's primarily, and most scholars today would argue the same thing, that the Koine Greek of the New Testament at least is primarily aspectual, and tense, time, in verb forms is a secondary, at best, item, right? And outside of the indicative mood, everybody agrees there is no time in the verb form at all. So this is an indicative verb, so some would argue that there is time in here, but it's a secondary thing. And the translators of the New American Standard all believed, and this kind of goes with the American Standard as well, that the tense form itself was time-oriented, and that's what you see coming out in the translation there. So before you even get to questions of theology and interpretation, you got a question here of how do you even understand the Greek to be working? And so here, when you look at something like this, it's not just a matter of, is this an accurate translation? The question is, how do you understand the Greek to be working? How do you understand verbs to function in Greek? And my personal position on this is that the time is not a primary issue in the indicative at all. In fact, I would say, yes, this is past tense, right? But it's past tense by merit of the fact that this is Jesus telling us something, and Jesus is no longer with us, so the text itself is based in the past, right? So we know that from the context rather than actually depending on the text itself to tell us that. And I think the better way to understand this is probably more like what we have with the RSV or the New International Version or the ESV here, that I have come. He's speaking about the fact that he's come here. The idea of the aorist tense form is just to point to the fact that Jesus is now here. There's a coming and he's now here. That's the idea. I have come then is, I think, the better way of translating that. Now, of course, if you've learned some Greek and you look at an English translation that says, I have come, you're going to say, I wonder if that's a perfect active indicative first person plural verb. And you'd be wrong. Because in most beginning Greek courses, they're going to teach you that when you translate using the word have, you're going to translate a perfect tense form using have, not an aorist tense form. And so here again is where understanding the language itself actually helps. And it's not just that you need to have gone through beginning Greek. I think the key issue here is experience reading the text itself to see that things like an aorist tense form is actually the least significant of all the verb forms in the New Testament. You're trying to say the absolute least when you use an aorist tense form. So here again, I don't think the point is here to issue to make a statement about when Jesus came, whether it was in the past, whether it was in the present, or any of those sorts of things. That's not the point that the author's trying to make here. He's just using this as a generic way just to say, I've come, right, for this purpose. Don't think that I've come for this purpose. So again, the idea here is this is really where the focus is in this verse. Don't think this, right? This then is all of a subordinate clause to nomicete. So this is not the main idea. The main idea is actually nomicete, me nomicete, rather than the hoti clause here, which tells you just don't think, what not to think, right? So it's just a secondary idea that supports the primary verb that we have just here, okay? So this is just, you can see just in this how complex the discussion around translation actually is. We just looked at two things here. Do not think, the way English has changed, and we've looked at the aorist tense form and how different translations approach that as well. And what you can see here is that you have kind of this hard sticking to one particular understanding of what the language, the original language, is doing on one end, and on the other end you've got another approach here with the Holman Christian Standard Bible. It's really just trying to make this understandable. Yes, they've made the same kind of distinction here as the New American Standard has, but I think that's offset with the don't assume, right? Rather than do not, which again is just quite literal, but we don't typically speak that way. We would normally just abbreviate our words and say, don't do this, right? And again, that's what he's done here as well. Don't assume that I came to destroy the law of the prophets. So the key thing you can see here is that it's really not a simple matter to translate Bible verses. There's all sorts of presuppositions that we bring even to the Greek and English, and the only way to really, as somebody wanting to study the text, if you're really wanting to study the text, the only way to know for sure what's going on really is to have experience in the Greek for yourself. And that means learning the language, learning it properly, and then reading it repeatedly and discussing it with other people so that you can start to think through some of these issues, and not just on your own, but actually bouncing off other people so that you've actually able to think through these things more critically. And by critically, I don't mean in a critical sense. I'm not trying to criticize the Bible. What I am trying to say here is we're trying to criticize our own thinking, right? So we're not just assuming that my thinking on this is accurate. I'm actually working with other people who have a good understanding of this as well, who can then sort of bring their expertise to bear on it as well. Now, that doesn't mean we're going to agree on everything, but it does help us to think about the position that we're taking, and we get a more thoughtful outcome as a result of doing that. Even how we understand verbs and how verbs are working, you can see even that makes a difference in the way we translate things. So it's not an easy question. So which translation is going to be the best for you is really going to depend on who you're serving and how you're wanting to serve them. Let me give you some recommendations very quickly. If you're working with a Bible and you're doing personal study, choose a formal equivalent translation, something that's quite accurate. And even take that, if you want to, into Bible studies and things like that. But if you're preaching from something, if you're preaching regularly from the pulpit, I would encourage you just to do a bit of a survey. What is it that the people in the pews are working with? And then use the translation that they're working with. There's nothing wrong with any particular translation. Yeah, committees are going to make decisions, and they're going to have philosophies and so on, and those are going to come out in every translation that you're going to do. But that doesn't make any translation better or worse than others. It just makes them different, right? And we're, frankly, in an English environment, we are spoiled for choice when it comes to translations. There are numerous languages in the world where they don't have more than, maybe one book of the Bible, or in some cases not even that, translated into their own language. So we have so many complete translations that it's really quite an embarrassment of riches. We are very, very well off. So let me ask you though, as I wrap up here, tell me your thoughts on Bible translations and which one do you use? Leave a comment in the comment section below. I look forward to hearing from you there. And do you mix and match? Do you use more than one translation? That is also a really good question, which I'd love to hear from you as well. And if you are interested in learning the language, and why wouldn't you be after seeing how difficult it can be just to do a good translation, then go and download the Roadmap to Mastery at masterntgreek.com/roadmap and consider joining us for our next Beginning Greek cohort, which we start one every quarter. So we're going to be starting one again very soon. So join in and learn Greek and actually get your head around and start to read the text for yourself so that you can see the issues and learn them and make your own decisions about how these things work. And then study it and then bring it out for other people so that they can benefit from what you learn as well. That's what we're all about at Master New Testament Greek, helping you learn the original language so that you can understand it, so it can transform your life, and that you can then pass on what you learn for others as well. That's it from me. Thanks so much for watching, and I look forward to serving you and being a blessing to you again in the future. Until then, keep taking small, consistent steps toward mastery. See you in the next one.